So hello everybody, my name is Kay Grieves. I'm part of the Gather team and it is wonderful to be here with you this afternoon. It's really interesting actually, looking at your backgrounds. They're starting to change. We're not all in our living room anymore. It's lovely to see, to see the Shard and some lovely open spaces. So yes, life is changing, guys. There's lots to be hopeful about. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about an audit and what that might look like. I mean, obviously an audit can mean so many different things. You can spend hundreds of thousands of pounds conducting a state of the city audit if you wanted to, a 100-page document with lots of glossy pictures. That is not only time consuming, but it's hugely expensive. So what we're going to be talking through this afternoon is how you can conduct just a very simple audit of your town or city that is both quick and cheap and relatively easy to deliver. So the first question, I guess, is why? Why should we do it? Well, we've been talking a lot already this morning about how important those civic contacts are. Well, it's one thing to be able to tell them how brilliant all the work is that the churches are doing in your town and city, but so much more valuable to be able to prove it. So by delivering a very simple audit and getting some data, you can share that data with your civic contacts. Another reason is that it helps us understand our own town and cities a little better. I think we all have a view, don't we? We all understand our own area, but maybe we don't have a view of the city or the town in its entirety. So conducting an audit will help you to do a gap analysis, what's missing in our town or city, where is there scarcity? And it might well also show up where there's duplication. If we have 5 food banks along one street in one high street and another area of the town has nothing, we are not serving our city as well as we could be. And an audit will help to show where those gaps are and where those duplications are. The other value of an audit is it gives you a baseline. So if we were, once you've conducted an audit, it gives you a baseline to say, this is where we are now. And then as you revisit that, as you deliver subsequent surveys, it can show you the trends within your town or city. Where is there growth? Are there some boroughs or some areas that are starting to struggle? Are the needs of the city changing? So it gives you a baseline of which you can look at trends and changes and help to have some really helpful conversations around that. And then finally, obviously, survey data can be used to inform our prayers, to help us pray in a much more focused and informative way. So lots of good reasons why we should do it. So how? Well, it can be very simple. We've recently conducted a survey across Greater Manchester, across the 10 boroughs. And I think the first thing that we'd say when looking at a survey is keep it as short and as simple as possible. You really do need to think about what questions are the most important. When you ask collaboratively, what questions do we want to ask? You could end up with hundreds of different questions. This would be interesting and that would be interesting. But I'd really counsel you to think, what is most important? Maybe think of up to 10 questions that would be the most valuable. It's much better, you'll probably get a much better yield of responses if you have a short survey conducted a number of different times than one huge detailed survey that takes several minutes to complete. What happens with that is people start it, but they drop out halfway through and you lose the value of your data. So really recommend that you would keep it short when you're looking at your questions. And in a moment, I'll go through the questions that we used in Greater Manchester for you to have a look at as an example. Next, choosing your platform. There are loads of different tools out there for conducting a simple online survey, and we'd recommend an online survey because that's quickest to get the responses back. We've looked at 2, so we've looked at SurveyMonkey and Google Forms. And a shout out to Lucy, who's on the call today. Lucy has pulled together for us a little 2-page document that talks through the details of SurveyMonkey and the benefits of that, and of Google Forms and how to use both of them. And after this call, we'll send out the notes so that if you want to use them, you can. But at very high level, SurveyMonkey, I've used SurveyMonkey a lot and it is great. But the free version does have limitations. So there's a maximum of 10 questions per survey, but there is also a limit of 40 responses per survey. We got a little caught out here, if I'm honest with you. So learn from our mistakes. If you do want to invest in it, the entry level cost is about £32 a month. However, Google Forms do something very similar, and that's completely free of charge. So you might prefer to use Google Forms. But as I said, following the call, we'll circulate the details and you can have a look at that. Channels for distribution, I mean, really, this is just to say to send it out as far and wide as you can. And you will probably need to keep pushing it. That was certainly our experience in Greater Manchester in order to get the engagement that you want. So use your core team, your personal contacts, use your borough connectors, send it out through denominations, churches together, your Christian charities, but send it out far and wide. Set a deadline, ask people to complete it by the deadline, but in reality, probably expect to extend it to get the numbers that you want to come in. But it's good to have an initial deadline to try and get people's focused and get the responses coming in as quickly as possible. Analysis and dissemination of results. So there's really two tiers, I think, to this. You will get an overview from your survey that gives the big picture. And that's probably the data that is going to be most useful for those civic contacts, for your core team, what's happening big picture wise within your town and city. And that can be really useful. But I'll also show you in a moment some examples of the individual detailed level. And that can be much more useful for sending out to your boroughs and your areas so they can drill down into a bit more detail. So this is the example. These are actually the questions that we used for our survey in Greater Manchester. So 10 questions, probably took, I don't know, about 5 minutes to complete this survey. So quite simply, the name of the church and the borough that they're in. Collecting the borough, if you've got more than one borough, it's really useful to have that. The denomination, if applicable. And then we simply listed these services here on the right-hand side. And we said, during COVID, which of these have you delivered? And then we asked the second question, post-lockdown, what do you think you will continue to deliver? So we can see how things are going to shift across the two. We asked people, what's the estimate number of different people who you've engaged with? Now that question could be framed in a number of different ways. You could say, how many people have you fed? How many meals have you provided? Slightly different ways, but we decided to say, how many different people have you engaged with? And then we asked for details about, do you plan to reduce, maintain, or extend your activity? So we can have a broad view of how services within the area are going to increase or decrease across time. We also then asked for email addresses and permission to keep their details. So we've then got a much larger base that we can engage with about movement for recovery within the region. So one or two examples of some outputs. This is an example of the output from the borough. So this is the summary data, but you can see how useful this is to show us the level of engagement across the boroughs. It tells a story straight away. You can see that Stockport in this example really engaged and very quickly got the surveys out there, and we got lots of responses. But it also told us a story about Rochdale and Tameside. And we immediately realised partway through the survey that we needed to go back to our borough connector for Rochdale and for Tameside to re-engage with them and to get them to resend that survey link out and get some more engagement. So this is a really helpful summary and a good example of why asking the borough is a really good question. This is some of the results that we got, some of the data around the activities that were delivered. And it shows quite clearly here, as we would all expect, that the majority of churches and organisations throughout COVID were delivering food distribution, so 75%. That picture changed when we were saying after COVID. So post-COVID, the number of people offering food distribution dropped slightly, but then the number of services that are currently low here around young adults and education, because that was more difficult to get contact with people during COVID, that's quite low. That then increased post-COVID, so people expect to be doing more outreach, going back to their toddler groups, back to their youth groups. So you can have this information by chart like this or by a graph. This is an example of the response that we got around the question, how many different people have you engaged with? And I think this is probably what we would have expected, but it's useful data to have. The majority of churches are dealing with up to 500 different people across COVID. But some of our churches, some of our organisations were dealing with over 5,000 different people across COVID. So there's some really very large organisations that are dealing with some really significant people across COVID. And then finally, I just wanted to pop this up. This is an example of the data that we then sent out to our borough connectors. So this is a subsection of the data that we broke down by borough, so that in Bolton, in this example here, we're able to say these are the churches that have responded so far. This is the services that they're currently offering. This is whether they're planning to increase or decrease their level of service. But for a borough connector, this information really is gold dust, because it helps them to have a really informed and engaged conversation with the people within their borough. It also helps them to see where are the gaps, who are the people within their borough that aren't responding or that we aren't engaged with, that we need to work with a little bit harder. So those are my examples of what we have done in Greater Manchester. A quick run through. Does anybody have any questions? I'm never sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing if people don't ask questions.
Kerry, a question. You sent this out to all the churches. Did you send it out to Christian charities, and what other sectors of the community did you send it to?
Yes, Peter. So we sent it as far and wide as we could. So we have an enabling team with about 10 people within our enabling team. And then we have, for each of our 10 boroughs, we have borough connectors, up to 3 or 4 borough connectors. So they were our main vehicles. So we'd sent them the link and asked them to push it out to all of their contacts. And then we had people such as Ian Rutherford with contacts within the Methodist section, and then we'd have some sent out. We had a contact for Churches Together, and we asked them to send it out to the Churches Together database. So we really were sending it out as far and wide as we could across churches, Christian organisations and charities within the Greater Manchester region.